Good morning, everybody. Rat, my terrible terrier, has started this morning's podcast off for us. And he's rather bemused because it's very, very early morning and we have hopped in the car and popped down just off the coast of Suffolk to Aldeburgh. It's just under an hour's drive from High Ash Farm. And I've had a telephone call from one of the members of the Suffolk Wildlife Trust who likes to keep me informed as to the arrival of one of our migrant bird species, the swift. And whilst I'm incredibly fascinated by swifts and probably the most aerial bird in the world, I'm equally fascinated by the relationship between the town of Aldeburgh and the swifts, because it's quite an ancient town, lots of old buildings, which are okay for swifts to nest in, but there's also been quite a lot of new development and a certain interest in the swifts as well, and it's resulted in the erection of lots of special swift nest boxes, including in the parish church, which is not far from me. It's been chilly and it's a little bit milder in the last few days, and that's resulted in the first wave of swifts coming up to the Suffolk countryside. There's reports of them being right down south at Margate as well and along the southern coast. But Aldeburgh has a special relationship, as I mentioned, with the swifts in that the town provides the nest boxes. But if I just walk up the shingle bank here, walk away from the sea just a little bit. There we go. Quite a steep bank here with sea defences just the other side of the top of the bank, and then several hundred acres of marshland with the River Old sort of skirting through the centre of the marshes. And that provides the ideal habitat for feeding the swifts. You get lots of insects there flying about with the water habitat and the marshland and the grazing marshes, and a little bit further inland, quite a large dairy herd there, and they're milked as well, so providing local cheeses as well. And there's that relationship between humans and the birds, which is what really fascinates me and intrigues me. That's why I've come down, because I want to see my first swift. It's very early in the morning. I should be back at the farm in time for work, but it's always worth it. I've seen lots of swallows going up and down side of the little dikes that have been dug across the marshland, but suitable habitat for them. Absolutely ideal, and most people miss actually seeing them, and they've done this incredible flight up from South Africa, several thousand miles, not stopping or resting on the way, which makes everybody scratch their head when they hear it's the most aerial bird in the world. Specially shaped, it's dusky, sort of black feathers, tiny little white patch under the chin, where they can fill that with insects that they catch and take back to the females in their nest, either in the nest boxes or natural nest sites under the old pan tiles all around the town, which is just beside me here. So the little white eggs, the female incubates them, and that's about the only time they come to ground, so to speak. Long wings, if they land on the ground, they really have great problem in taking off again because of the shape of the wings. They're long and narrow, kind of sickle shape, and their eyes are kind of sunk in their head like the old early sports cars, and they have very weak legs which are held up in the feathers on the body, and the shape doesn't seem quite right for a bird that spends its entire life flying around, because it's like a torpedo. It's quite blunt at the front, and then the bird tapers away, but that's in perfect symmetry with its environment. Actually, the drag as the bird goes through the air is hugely reduced, and so you can learn a lot from the shape of a swift as well. So fascinating birds, and I say that they can collect insects on the wing, which is the only way they feed. They don't come to ground to feed, and this sort of the group of insects that they collect in their beak doesn't get digested by the male. It's collected in what's called a bolus, and he can eject that if he goes back to the nest and feeds the female if and when she's incubating. But with the cool weather you sometimes have in May, their average arrival time is about the 15th of May, but you always have a vanguard ahead of that, a few birds arriving and then different waves coming in until the sky in certain places is almost full of them. But there's not so many about as there used to be, certainly in my childhood. The farm area back at High Ash Farm near Norwich there would be absolutely filled with screaming swifts, and it's since I've been growing environmental stewardship crops, things like mustard and fodder radish, which come into flower and attract pollen beetles. The pollen beetles then swarm at certain times of the year in warm weather, which usually coincides the end of May, early June, and that enables the swifts to feed en masse. And suddenly some of the fields at High Ash Farm are absolutely covered in swarming swifts. It's an amazing sight. How they don't collide with each other, I don't know. But the swifts are just amazing birds. Once you learn about them, it just makes me smile anyway. Because they sleep on the wing, they can shut one half of their brain down. People say I do even better than that. But and then they go to sleep and sort of have cat naps while they're flying at night high up. So they drink on the wing and sometimes come to the areas of water at High Ash Farm and on very hot days in June and scoot down and get a beak full of water. And they mate on the wing as well, which is quite amazing to see. And the male will fold his wings almost upright in a V shape and then land on the female's back whilst they're both flying and mate like that. And they're long-lived birds as well. Some swifts are 10, 15 years old, quite normal. And during that time, because they're flying 24/7, apart from when they're nesting and apart from when the young are in the nest, as I said, the most aerial bird in the world. But it's such a lovely sight this morning. It's just beginning to warm up a little bit and my eyes are cast skyward now, just looking for that sickle shape flying about close to the edge of Aldborough Hair. So I'll wait about and be patient. And many people ask me why or how I got interested in wildlife, and occasionally I give talks about this, explaining a kind of light bulb moment, I suppose you could call it. And that's what really triggered my interest in wildlife, although I was always brought up on the farm, and quite often Sunday dinner time, lunchtime in the middle of the day, that was, nearly everything on the farmhouse table cooked by my mum would have been from the farm. That would be pheasants and obviously the milk, some cream. My mum would make butter and cheese as well, and then flour as well. So the whole vegetable patch was certainly in the farm garden, which was walled. There was fruit growing on the walls, espalier trees. My father grew strawberries, gooseberries, raspberries, and then there was an apple orchard as well with Bramleys and Cox's orange pippin there, and several other older varieties of apples as well. So you got kind of used to food coming from where you lived, and it wasn't transported at all, so you got used to that. And it wasn't until much later on, being a traditional farmer and having the sort of sporting element on the farm as well, where lots of friends and guests would get together and have a shoot through the shooting season on Saturdays. And it was on one of those occasions where I'd organised quite a large shoot. There was about 18 guns on the shoot, and then half a dozen beaters as well, which would go through the woodland, beating the bramble bushes to get the pheasants out, or the woodcock. And it was at the end of a particular day, quite a long day, late Saturday morning it started and finished about 4 o'clock in the afternoon in early October. We'd had quite a successful shoot, perhaps 20 brace of pheasants, that would be 40 pheasants, a dozen brace of grey partridge and some red-leg partridge as well, woodcock, foo snipe. They're all game birds, as was then, and there was always plenty of them. There'd be hares, rabbits, and anything else as well that could be eaten. And at the end of the shoot, there would always be a vote of thanks given by somebody, and braces of pheasants would be handed out to the beaters as a thank you. That'd be 2 pheasants each for them, and they'd be quite happy with that because that would be quite a good meal later on in the week. And the rabbits always found a home, and anything else would be sold and help to raise a little bit of money for upkeep of the shoot on the farm. And it was right at the end of this particular shoot that really changed everything and explains perhaps why I'm here and come down to Suffolk. That would have been a mad thing to do 25 years ago, or a bit longer than that, when this huge change happened. And the vote of thanks went ahead as normal, and it was quite an eminent doctor on the shoot, and he turned around and said, "I'd like to thank Chris for such a wonderful afternoon's fun." He just used a different word to what would be normal, because we all knew it was sport, and it's quite good sport to, and challenging as well, to have a gun and to shoot pheasants on the wing, or partridges in particular, and even harder to shoot woodcock, and particularly difficult snipe. So that challenge is there. It's called sort of sport, and it's very, very traditional as well. You always did things in a particular way, and it was regulated by when you can shoot things and when you can't shoot things. But that word, thank you for a wonderful afternoon's fun, made me sort of stop in my tracks. I knew something had happened. I couldn't explain it at the time, and it took a year or 2 years for the sudden change round from shooting for sport to not shooting at all, because the realisation that that relationship between man and the wildlife, because of our behaviour in the 1970s and 80s, when we did all the stubble burning with a box of matches, hedge grubbing and things like that, and you started to realise how difficult it was for some of the species to thrive. And that's why I've come down to Suffolk, because I hugely appreciate the birds migrating up here and how difficult it is for them, because the climate's changing, our attitude to wildlife is changing, not always in a good way, I must say. Modern agriculture is quite a hostile environment for our wildlife to be in, particularly things like hares. Grey partridge is now a red list species, which wasn't there. Woodcock, again, quite a common game bird, or a game one you can shoot for sport, is another red list species. Nobody's releasing woodcock or snipe, and so there's this conflict that's beginning to happen. So it's a really difficult relationship, because some birds nest out on arable land. Sometimes things like, just trying to think of all the species, well, yellowhammer's another red list species. Stone curlew will nest out, particularly in sugar beet fields, some of which are being sprayed with quite a lethal chemical called neonicotinoid, and that can kill all the insects in the field, which is what the skylarks feed on, of course. Although you don't get many wildflowers and bees affected, you certainly have insects in sugar beet fields. And so this huge relationship between modern farming, the need and wish to look after our wildlife, and our modern way of existing, roads which are getting faster and faster. Wildlife find that very difficult with all the species of deer we have out in East Anglia at the moment. So it's a long and difficult story. But in the short, that's why I'm here today. I've learned to make that huge turn. Some people would call me a deserter. I'm certainly not that. I'm as much as a farmer as any other farmer listening, and more of a sportsman than perhaps you'd realise. But that's a relationship between food on the table and existing, rather than having that particular word fun for doing something. without thinking about it, and that's the difficult thing. Tradition is such a powerful thing, particularly out in the countryside. So there we are, a little bit of explanation as to why I'm here, but nevertheless I'll just walk back down this shingle bank. Rat's waiting patiently at the top of the shingle. He thinks we're going for a walk. Well, we might squeeze a short walk in, but just before I finish, just listen to this. It's such a wonderful, relaxing sound. Gentle waves. That one was quite a large one, lapping on the shingle shore. Here at Aldeburgh.
Chris Skinner's Countryside Podcast with Matthew Gudgeon.
Well, I've come to the farm to see Chris Skinner for our weekly podcast in the countryside. We're at Caister St Edmund, High Ash Farm, and I can see Chris in the distance. Now, I was worried that he wouldn't be here because he's been on holiday for the last week and now he's back. So, Chris, good to see you again. Do you have a nice holiday?
Well, you call it holiday, Matthew. Yes, I sort of work all the time, really. So I had a quick trip down to Aldeburgh to visit the swifts are just arriving, and I saw my first 2 swifts of the year, and I'll explain a bit about that on the podcast, and very excited. But look, we're on one of the old horse pastures here at the farm. And you remember a few weeks ago I told you about some of the nettles that don't sting. Just look over there, a patch of nettles covered in white flowers, white dead nettle, just superb.
They sting. They sting?
No, they don't. If it's got dead in the name, the same as the red dead nettle, neither of those species sting. But you make a mistake and get hold of a stinger thinking it's a white dead nettle, then you will get peppered. So,
well, I'm not going to risk it.
But we've come here for another reason, because skirting the whole edge of this old meadow are some magnificent trees that have been here since I was a child. It's a bit cool and cloudy, odd spits of drizzle in the wind, but I can still see some bees flying about, because the tree, there's a bee, just there, look, through there, yes. Can you see?
Yes.
Yep, that's a honeybee gathering the nectar, because this tree kind of symbolises summer, I suppose, which we haven't had much of yet, but nevertheless it's coming to flower, and you have these huge kind of candelabras hanging upwards rather than downwards, and it's the horse chestnut, and it's absolutely superb. We stand back a few steps.
These are fabulous, aren't they?
It's Britain's, in fact, Europe's largest leaf on any tree. Comes from sort of Bulgaria, Iran, over in the sort of Mediterranean region, so it's not really a native. It was introduced in the 1600s into the UK, and it's all over the farm. We have some fantastic specimens. There's one there, probably well over 1,000 flowers on it.
And these little pyramids of white flowers, yes, sticking up from the ends of the branches.
Yes, and the leaves are quite incredible. They can be 6 or 8 individual leaflets all on one leaf stalk, and it can be 7 or 8 inches across, really large. And they've got a trick up their sleeves. They can angle themselves according to where the sun is to get the most from the heat of the sun, which isn't here today.
I was going to say, yeah.
Nevertheless, it's a tree of all seasons, really, because over the winter months it has sticky buds on it, and if you can reach up, you'd have a job here, because the horses have grazed the lower branches, and the low branches are kind of parallel with the ground. The horses love the leaves and the flowers if they can reach them. And so just a stunning tree to see. And later on in the year, after those sticky buds have opened up, they're sticky to help protect the unfurled leaves from insect attack, and they will open up if you pick them in a jar in January. Another bee just coming in. Oh, that's a wow! Oh, it's
very bright red.
I'm not sure what. Oh, it's a mason bee. It's red, rufous red, Osmia rufa. That one, but it has changed its name, like all these scientific names keep changing, but nevertheless that was what that one is. Really stunning. And so comes into flower now, and then over the summer it's one of the first trees to come into leaf in the UK. Over the summer, late summer, the leaves turn golden, shrivel up and drop on the ground, but just before that conkers are formed, and I used to have sort of conker battles with my friend where you thread one of those lovely glossy dark brown shiny conkers on a piece of string, and you challenge your mates, and then you got into tricks like soaking them in vinegar or baking them in the oven.
I bet you were up to all of those,
weren't you? I was up to everything and more besides, which we won't go into.
I mean, the thing about playing
I had
games...
a stone with a hole through it, and I painted it.
Oh, yeah, that sounds like you.
Yes.
Yeah. But the thing is, though, playing games with conkers, it proves how poor eating they are.
Yes, absolutely. They're not really eaten. Although it's called a horse chestnut, people years ago used to grind the conkers up and make a kind of poultice for horses who had a cough. And the horses wouldn't eat it because conkers are so bitter. In fact, conkers is an early constituent of gunpowder, would you believe? So, but it's more likely it's got its name. If we did reach up and take one of the leaves off, it will leave a scar that looks very much like a horse's hoof print. So hence horse chestnut. Although it's not related to our other chestnut tree, which is another introduced, which is the sweet chestnut, completely different species. You can see the trunk, which you'd have to walk quite a way to get to, is grey and sort of deeply fissured as well, and there's some ivy going up this one. But it's not used very much for timber. It will rot quickly. It's very white and creamy and very soft. Furniture makers don't really use it because of that, but sometimes toy makers will use it. But travelling up through High Ash Farm, right beside Caister Lane, some of the trees are hanging right over the road, and there's those fabulous candelabras, we can call them, right over the top. Now, if I just reach up and pull a branch down, just pretending I'm a horse, here we are. We can get some close to some of the flowers here. Oh, here comes some. There. That's exactly what I wanted to show you.
There's some colour on those white flowers.
There is. The ones near the tip, which have just emerged, have a yellow centre where the stamens are. And once they're pollinated, it's almost as though they're embarrassed and they've gone pink in the centre. And those have been pollinated, and they should ripen to form our conkers much later in the autumn.
It looks like raspberry ripple ice cream.
It does, yeah, that lovely creamy white of the petals, followed by the pink in the centre to show that a bee's been there, and it happens really quickly. Certainly within 24 hours, changes from the yellow of the unpollinated flower to that vivid pink. We'll let that branch go back up, and you can see there's this grazing line underneath, because the horses absolutely love the foliage in preference to the grass on this field. So there we are, one of the signs of summer, which is just round the corner, and usually flowers last week of April, first 2 weeks of May, and then it's all over again, and you have to wait another year to see a display like this. And it's one of those things out in the countryside at this time of the year that it's easy to miss. There's a special display, I think it's still there, in Bushy Park in Teddington in London, and it's planted a huge avenue of horse chestnut trees planted by the Victorians, and thousands of people used to come and see it. It's one of those lovely pleasures in life that doesn't cost anything, and almost it makes you tearful when you see, oh, a little touch of sun just coming out. And just look here in this little alcove between the two trees. It's just illuminating it, and we're being serenaded in the background by a missel thrush.
The horse chestnut, look out for the white flowers. Or if you're in Norwich in particular, look out for the different coloured flowers, because you get a reddish flower as well.
Yes, you do. That's a species that's crossed with the English horse chestnut and the American buckeye. So, and the two cross together make fertile conkers still, but you get the pink flowered one version instead. So very close relative. There are two others, a Japanese horse chestnut and the Indian one as well. They all flower much later, but they are all closely related, and they will crossbreed as well. But nothing like this. The white horse chestnut, I think it's unbeatable.
Another part of the farm, another horse pasture, and I've done my bit to wrangle some of these horses so they got out of the way. I hope you were impressed with that.
Is that what's called wrangling, was it?
Oh, I shoot a horse.
That's better. You shot. Oh, you're turned into a blacksmith, have you?
Actually, he's over there. Did you see?
I did
Yeah.
actually watch. I was sort of semi-impressed anyway.
Just call me John Wayne for now. Another part of the farm and another flowering tree.
Yes, Matthew, we've been following the flowering series of trees all coming into flower at different times, and I think it was about 2 weeks ago we visited the blackthorn, and blackthorn comes into flower before it comes into leaf, and we're now visiting quite a close relation to it in some way, because hawthorn does the opposite. First of all, it comes into leaf, then it comes into flower, and hawthorn has another name which is known all over the UK. It's called May, and because it comes into flower in the month of May, early May, and it's May and the week ahead of us, so I thought it appropriate to come and visit some of the hawthorn here at the farm. We've got 23 miles of hedge, and it's cut every third year, and when you cut hawthorn, it stops it flowering because it flowers on last year's growth. So when you see a nice, neatly clipped garden hedge of hawthorn and there's no flowers on it at this time of the year, that's because we've snipped off all the last year's growth. Whereas if it's left, and so I've brought you onto Caister Park, there's an old quarry in front of us, and you don't often see this, a hawthorn tree. They're really long-lived. They can outlive an oak tree, so a really old hawthorn can be up to 1,000 years old. These are probably 200 to 300 years old in front of us. The bark on the tree is grey, gnarled, twisted, rather like me in fact, but it's venerable and it's really hardwood. It burns well, but because it doesn't grow to any great girth, it's not often used for much at all. So it's a brilliant hedging plant though, because like the blackthorn we visited a couple of weeks ago, finished flowering now, hawthorn still bears all those prickles, so it's a much better plant to use for hedging because it hasn't got the trick that blackthorn has. Blackthorn, if you plant a blackthorn sapling, after about 3 or 4 years you'll see a dozen or so saplings or suckers coming up a yard or two away from the original plant, so it'll form huge clumps. Blackthorn, hawthorn doesn't do that. When it's planted, it usually stays where it's been put, so it's an ideal hedging plant. Still has all those prickles on it. So if we walk up a little bit, because this one in front of us, venerable old tree, is coming into flower. We're halfway up it actually, because it's on a steep bank, nearly vertical in places, as the edge of this old quarry, and so we're getting a kind of aerial view of it, and in the next day or two with a little bit more sunshine it's in full flower, but nevertheless it's making an impressive display already. 2 sorts of hawthorn in the UK, Midland hawthorn, which is much more found in the south and west of the UK, and common hawthorn, which this one is, deep ribs on the leaves, almost to the centre vein, and a single pip later in the year as well. So after finished flowering, you have little halls developing on all the growth, and they ripen over the summer, still green in July, August, and then they start to turn a lovely deep red in September and October, and often stay on the tree right through the winter months, Matthew. So brilliant food for thrushes, blackbirds, starlings will raid it as well. And then once December's here and the winter visiting thrushes, things like redwing, fieldfare as well, they'll come and raid any remaining berries. So Midland hawthorn has usually 2 or 3 seeds in each berry, and English hawthorn just has the single seed, and they're special seeds. So the red berry, the coating and all the flesh round is very attractive to birds, but the little seeds in the centre have a special coating on to stop them being digested by the birds. So they'll pass right through the bird's alimentary canal and come out absolutely untouched by the digestive process in the bird, which has grit in the gizzard. So completely unharmed, and then the bird will fly off and roost up, perhaps in a clearing or something like that. Seeds then drop onto the ground, and you can have a new hawthorn tree getting there like that. Sometimes people feed them to chickens, gather the berries, so they all pass through, and then you dig up the chicken muck, you dig it just gently into the ground, just cover it up slightly, and you have a whole row of baby hawthorn, and that's enough to start a new hedge off. So you can do it that way, so it works well like that.
The point is, though, cut down a mature hawthorn like this, and it happens, I know, then you're losing an ecosystem and a place for the birds to be protected and to feed. Really, these have to be looked after, don't they?
Oh, yes, yeah. And the hedges on the farm, we cut them every 3rd year, so we go round the farm in a rotation, so at least there's some of the hedges that have really heavy crops of berries on, and of course it just doesn't feed the birds in the winter that I mentioned. You've got all the pollinating insects on there now. It's a top species for many of our moths as well, things like the lovely name burnished brass moth and winter moth as well. They all lay their eggs, and the caterpillars devour the foliage, and of course that then feeds the birds. All those caterpillars in sort of mid-May onwards, right and through to the end of June, there's a whole host of different caterpillars all hatching in succession, and of course that feeds many of the small birds. Some of our migrants like whitethroat and blackcap will eat the caterpillars, as well as many of the other bird species absolutely dependent. Then any berries that aren't eaten by all the thrushes in the autumn drop on the ground, and then you have the small mammals on the ground actually sort of caching all those fruit on the ground into their burrows, and that's another way that they can germinate. They're carried into the ground, and the mice, things like long-tailed field mice, devour loads of them and leave that hardened pip in the middle, the little seed in fact. As they say, you only get 1 with an English hawthorn and 2 or 3 with a Midland hawthorn. So to see these is quite unusual. To see a hawthorn tree like this is a little bit unusual these days. Most of them are in hedgerows. You can see this is one right on the top edge of the quarry, has been nibbled, all the fresh growth, by the horses. And can you see there's not a single flower on it at all, because the horses could reach right round and they've grazed it, because the freshly emerged foliage, which happens at this time of the year, if we walk up closely to this, you can have a little look. It's very, very tender, and see, there's no flowers on it whatsoever, and it's very tender. You can snip one off like that, and you can see the shape of those leaves. Each leaf, the heavily divided right up to the midriff. Look, it's like a little leaf with 6 leaflets on it,
but never gets a chance to have a flower because of the horses.
That's right, but it used to be fed to children in the 1800s and early 1900s, and it was called bread and cheese, and it was a very cheap way of feeding your children rather than going to the local takeaway.
And you kept the tradition going?
That's why I've got these rosy cheeks, you see. Yes. Yes, so I did keep the tradition going. But you can see some of the old venerable hawthorns further into the quarry there, absolutely dense as anything, and in another day or two, a little bit further north, those ones completely sheltered from the northerly wind, but in a day or two that will be snow white, as though the whole quarry side here is dressed up, ready to go off to a wedding.
A wonderful sight of May Hawthorne.
Yes, the other name for it, May, perfect, and that describes the beginning of summer, which the 1st of May for me certainly is.
The rooks certainly enjoy it.
I can hear them in the background there. We're quite close to a new rookery in the top of those Scots pine trees just behind us, and we're being sworn at in rook language for being a little bit too close to their nests. Humans are not trusted by rooks.
Suppose we better clear off then.
I think that's what they were saying, very politely.
The ducks at High Ash Farm going in to roost for an evening. Hey everyone, it's Matthew here, and if you've been enjoying our countryside podcasts, we've got a small favour to ask.
Yes, Matthew. What we're going to do is to ask for a small donation to help run the podcast, and any surplus goes for conservation at High Ash Farm here. And so it's really important. We both love to keep the podcast going, and that duck agrees with me, I think.
Well, it's straightforward to donate. You can make a one-off donation or set up a small monthly contribution, and the address is highashfarm.com/podcast.
We're hugely grateful for any support. It means we can keep sharing the stories of the countryside, which I love doing each week, but it's that small amount of cost we need to cover. So thank you very much in advance.
Well, we've repaired to Chris's farm truck to talk about your correspondence this week because, well, just for the plain reason that I'm a softie and it's freezing out there, isn't it?
And I've had to shut the windows on the truck, and Gudgeon's shoulders are up by his ears to give you an idea how cold it is.
We were talking about moths earlier on the May, and Judith has sent a photograph of what looks to me like a moth clinging on to a plant of some sort. She says, would you be able to enlighten us as to what this interesting insect is? We spotted it whilst gardening.
Well, I'm on first name terms with perhaps 100 species of moth, but I looked at this one and it looked very close to one that I know quite well, which is called the mullein moth. Then I looked a little bit more carefully and used a magnifying glass on it, and I found out exactly what it is. It's a chamomile shark. What a name for a moth.
He's not a looker, is he?
No, he's got a sort of furry protuberance out at the front and the coloured wings, and it kind of looks like a dried up plant petal, really, a very pale cream one. But when you think of the word chamomile, you think, oh, that's the sort of plant you put in your lawn and it's very aromatic if you tread on it. And yet there are close relations to the chamomile, which are plants like mayweed. Stinking mayweed is one that grows here on the farm, and it's quite a common weed, and it's also quite a common moth, which flies exactly at this time of the year, late April to mid-May, even to the end of May, and that's what you've got. So a chamomile shark. There you are. What a name.
Another photograph comes from Lily in Framlingham. Thank you for this. It's two ladybirds doing, well, it looks to me what comes naturally. And Lily says, well, these obviously have spring fever. I wondered if you could tell me anything about ladybirds and their young. For instance, do they lay eggs?
Well, the quick answer to that one is yes, they do lay eggs, and lots of them, usually in little bunches of 30, 40, 50. Quite often on the underside of stinging nettle leaves, and then the larvae hatch out, and they larvae don't look anything at all like their parents. They're kind of long, sort of caterpillar shape little things in grey with sort of red dots on them, and basically they're aphid eaters. So if you've got roses in your garden and you see these strange grey creatures crawling about, they're devouring as many as 100 aphids a day. They really are sort of look like chieftain tanks going around on the top of your roses or your broad beans, for instance, which usually have high infestations of aphids. So lovely creatures. Then these pupate, and after about 10 days they will come out of their pupa and form the ladybirds that we know. But we've got, I don't know, probably 45 different species here in the UK. 2-spot, 4-spot, 6-spot, 7-spot, 12-spot, 18-spot, 22-spot, and the largest 24-spot. That's the largest number of spots on it. But the last one I mentioned, the 24-spot, is yellow in colour, and it's a vegetarian, so it doesn't eat the aphids. All the rest are pretty cannibalistic, carnivorous as well. They will eat each other's too. So lots and it was originally called Our Lady's Bird, and it comes from the Virgin Mary. And remember, when Jesus was crucified, there was blood, and so the red on the ladybird's wing cases are meant to represent Jesus's blood. And the 7 spots, because we've got a 7-spot ladybird in amongst that list, that illustrates the 7 trials and joys and sorrows of Our Lady. So, and I don't know if you remember, way back in 1975, we had a dry, warm summer, followed by a dry, warm winter, Matthew. And that was the ideal sort of catalyst for one of the biggest insect explosions that the UK has seen, because in the summer of 76, that hot summer, I don't know what you were up to back then. But
well, I was in short trousers.
Oh,
but I remember, pictures on the TV of people wading through huge drifts, like snow drifts of ladybirds,
yes,
crunching through them.
They were, and people were getting nibbled and bitten because they were after the moisture on people's skin. And there were bucket loads of our own bred ladybirds, and they were joined because there was some easterly breeze coming from Western Europe, from Denmark, even from Sweden as well, and from Belgium and Germany, and they came across the North Sea. And I could just remember the pictures on Yarmouth seafront, and I went there and I saw it, and you couldn't believe the numbers. People were having to go indoors to get out of the infestation, and if you got them on your skin, they'd often leave a tiny little yellow drop, and it is in fact their blood, but it was a defence mechanism, because if you have red out in the countryside, it's a warning. There's 1 or 2 moth species that use that coloration as well. The cinnabar moth, for instance, bright red coloration, and if you bite into a cinnabar moth, then you quickly won't forget the experience because they're very acidic. And if you did taste this little blob of bright yellow that ladybirds leave on your skin, I've tried it, and it is so acidic that you would not want to eat a ladybird. So a lot of creatures that would eat them leave them well alone. So Our Lady's Bird is where it comes from, because they've opened those wing cases up and they can fly. So that's where the name comes from.
Thanks for the question, Lily. Next we go to Peterborough, or just outside, a village near Peterborough where Susan Young lives. Susan says, "Hello Chris, heard the cuckoo today from woods near the riverbank where I walk. Regarding skylarks, they sing over the cornfields where I live. When the farmers spray, which they do frequently, I worry the nests, the eggs and the babies get sprayed. Do you think they always nest around the edges?"
No, they don't nest in the edges. Many of our bird species are specialists in the habitat that they occupy. Skylarks won't. They usually nest out in the middle of big open fields, particularly the North and South Downs. That's a favourite area for them. We've got some large arable fields here of grassland here at the farm. We're sitting on one at the moment, and that's favourite skylark habitat. They nest on the ground. Some of my wildflower fields, I ask the horses in the middle of winter to ride round on the fields and make little hoof prints when the ground's still soft, and that's a little like false egg cup into the ground, a nest cup if you like, and then the female skylark will line that with grass and lay the camouflaged eggs in there. And so that's one way, and we've got lots and lots of them here at the farm. But as I've mentioned many times over the podcast, modern agriculture is a very hostile place for many of our native species, be they mammals or birds or insects as well. And so it's a really tough call for them, and that's perhaps why, one of the many reasons that skylarks have become a red list species, a species sort of in serious decline, usually declined by 50% or more in the last 20 so years. And so I do worry about them, because some of the chemicals could affect the actual incubation of the eggs and as to whether they will stay fertile or not.
Stephen Alger lives not many miles away from the farm in Acle. He says, we walked from Acle to Great Yarmouth at dawn this morning. That's a good walk, isn't it? And we saw the first swallow of the year. Also, muntjac, Chinese water deer, and a big herd of huge red deer. That's a good spot, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And whilst I was at Aldeburgh on my brief visit, quite close to the beach, there was some mud on the tracks just the other side of the shingle bank, and there was Britain's largest land mammal, the red deer footprints, the very distinctive slots, about 4 inches from front to back, and a cloven hoof in the mud. Very clear to see, but becoming quite common in this part of the world. Look in front of you, there's another nice mammal for you, Matthew.
Oh, a hare.
No. Remember, it's near the edge of the field.
Rabbit.
That's much better,
Yes.
yeah. Then we'll go for rabbits. 1, 2, 3, right in front of the truck, look. Out in broad daylight.
I thought it was a hare because he was sitting up,
yes,
like the hares do.
Yes, yeah, they do. That's easy to confuse them. Many people are confused by the two. Look at that, just doing a bit of sunbathing.
I can see several there.
Yes,
yeah.
That's it. And after a moment or two, lay down. The sun's just coming out, and we look over at that hawthorn we just saw. Just look at that. It's just being lit up by this sun. Very welcome.
Now, Tony Bridge wants to say thank you, Chris, for putting him on to trail cameras. He sent us a video of all the wonderful things he's spotted with his new toy, put it in a quiet place in his garden, and what a result, he says.
Exactly, and I've had a look at the video. A female muntjac deer. Very good indeed. Well spotted, well shot in the nicest possible way.
And here's Mark Parry with a photograph, and I think we've had some video as well, of this fox. Mark says, we've got a fox taking up residence in our neighbours and our garden. We live in an urban environment in Crawley. That's Sussex, isn't it? West Sussex. And this fox, although wary of us when we go into the garden, seems not to have a care in the world. He slept on our shed roof from 9 in the morning until 8 p.m. in full view, and only moved when having a stretch. I suppose he's getting warmth there, isn't he?
Absolutely, and it's a sort of fabric roof on the shed, and it does get really warm, and foxes, as well as many of our other mammals, love to sunbathe. And I just noticed one of the rabbits over there in front of us doing exactly the same thing. It's not sitting, it's laying down on its side, just to the left of the one at the bottom of the tree, and believe it or not, it's sunbathing, exactly like that fox.
Thanks for all your lovely letters and emails, and keep them coming in. The address to send is chris@countrysidepodcast.co.uk. And if we don't mention all of them on the podcast, Chris certainly reads all of them.
I certainly do, and it's a joy each week to have such a lovely postbag of those questions, and I just love looking at them and being able to answer as many as I can. I'm sorry we can't do them all, but nevertheless, it always brings a smile and a very warm feeling to help some of our listeners.
Looks like Watership Down over there.
It does now. Just start the little truck up and see how close we can get. That one's still laying down flat on its side, and we're 20 yards away. But having said that, these rabbits are used to the horses, and the ladies walking past them several times a day when they visit their horses. Look at that.
They look quite healthy, don't they?
They certainly are. Myxomatosis seems to abandon them at this time of the year, and it's not until they start going down to burrows again. That one skirted off, and one very healthy one sitting right in front of the truck, less than 10 yards, and I think the further one's got a case of the fleas. It's having an itch.
Makes me want to do the same.
Right, you are a bit irritating.
That's the nicest thing you've ever said.
Nearly.
See you next week.
Bye.